My paper is Brazil and Sierra Leone, on a perspective on liberated Africa in Rio de Janeiro, 19th century. There was a document for President of Province of Rio de Janeiro in May of 1852. The president said on the suppression of transatlantic slave trade in Brazil drove Lei Eusébio de Queiroz since 1850. According to him, every authorities that province had to pay attention with the illegal slave trade. It was more common in place with connection with Ocean Atlantic through some rivers and bays. In that document, we can see a list of the ports where happened disembarkation of illegal slaves in Fluminense territory. I have a map. Angra dos Reis is one. Barra de São João, Cabo Frio, Búzios, Maricá, tem Itacuruçá, So, therefore, the local government had to pay to if their own place. That document ignored the previous Brazilian laws that became the Atlantic slave trade illegal in Brazil before 1850. According to the law of the 1831, every Africans who take off by British Navy or by any Brazilian embarkation were liberated. Then, Brazilian government created a specific social category for those people, the liberated Africans. Another example, there was an international agreement between England and Portugal that established every liberated African in Brazil needed to take a time to learn about the free work and citizenship. After the 14 years wanted that learning, they could choose to keep in Brazil or go back to Africa, since they could pay the cost of trip or live for themselves, ou viver por si. In the chart, we have the different agreements and the laws and the charters from Brazilian government about the liberated Africans and the abolition of the slave trade, Atlantic slave trade. While Brazilian government does not decide on those African people, they were in the house of prison, ou casa de correção. That place was home of the main African people for a long time. After that, they were sent to different public construction like factory, roads, and the hospital. Some of them worked in a private business too. Then there were two ways of explore liberated Africans in Brazil. In the public business, the public construction, or in the private business. They should work for 14 years in both cases. The conditions of life was very bad. Many scholars have stated they are the same slave conditions, the same slave conditions of life. The factory of Fer in Estrela, ou Fábrica de Pólvora da Estrela, Estrela was a place around Rio de Janeiro city, received liberated Africa among its workers in 1837. It was the first one time. Although the director of that factory asked only men and adult workers, but he received a lot of women and children too. They were in halls of the prison longer, and the government wanted they leave from there. From 2 years, the same factory in Estrela received more than 80 workers. All of them was liberated Africa, and the majority was men and adults, like a desire of the director. I was in this factory 2 weeks ago, and I got this picture. It was a monument in honor for liberated Africa who worked in that factory. Another case was the Estrada da Estrela. It's a road close in this factory. That road linked the Rio de Janeiro city with the province of Minas Gerais. In fact, between 1837 and 1855, that public construction received liberated Africa. I found different documents on this situation, but there is a special issue about it. It is a receipt of the 47 liberated Africa who started to work in that road in 1855. I would like to think that after the Brazilian laws of suppressions, liberated Africa was work for take their social rights. It is a contraction, what I intended to analyze in this paper too. Unfortunately, that list of liberated Africa only have their names. However, I found another document that provides names, ages, nations, and marks. So I organized a chart with these informations. It is a chart. There are liberated Africa. I have 4 people who work in that road, in that factory. There are many information from chart 1 about liberated Africans' life. The majority of names that is here, I could to see them in a previous list in 1847. What I'm saying here, many people arrived in that factory in 1837. In 20 years after, I found the same people working in the same factory or in the same street, in the same road. It indicates that liberated Africa will continue working in the same public construction for a long time. It involves sociability, identity, and common experience among them. There is not any woman in this list, while they were the majority in the previous list. I am not sure those every woman were emancipated. It's a difference because in the factory, in the fábrica de pólvora, factory of fair, I found many women and the children. But in the Estrada da Estrela, it is a construction close to the factory. I found only men. In the outside, only men. Inside the factory, men, women, and children. In the factory, I found 2 slavery too. Not only liberated Africa, but slaves too. This list is on work of Estrada Normal da Estrela. Another case is about younger slaves. I can identify many young Africans who worked among adults. For example, we have one slave called Leon from Cabinda. It is in 1856, he was 14 old. but I found him 90 years before. So I can realize he was he arrived in the fact of Estrela probably with 5 years old, but he was a worker with 5 years old. Then okay, the nation of Africa are are fantastic issues in that document. Why 11 people were from Mozambique, 20 other ones were from Cabinda, Benguela, Congo, Angola. Mary Cash indicates, for example, 79% of all liberated African Rio de Janeiro were from West Central Africa. I suppose a lot of those people came to Brazil together. Probably they shared same embarkations. I have located some documents on liberated Africa in Brazil archive which demonstrate a connection between Sierra Leone and Brazil drove the British and the Brazilian Mixed Commission between 1821 and the 1860. It is in my contention that such analysis will broaden our understanding of the cultural and social impact of African migration, despite the extinct literature on the suppression policies of the British Navy as they relate to Brazil. There has been little analysis of this liberated Africa as representative of the large migration. Liberated Africans have been studied to a limited degree in Brazil, and not in the context of the complete liberated African population, including those who went to Sierra Leone. In a letter received by Brazilian government from Sierra Leone in 1820, it described a details landed people of Brazilian embarkation from Sierra Leone. It is the day of Sierra Leone. It is attached in the letter from Sierra Leone to Brazil in the 1820. My research explores how the British suppression of the transatlantic slave trade impacted the relationship between the Africa coast and Brazil. In this context, Sierra Leone is an important location because both the Portuguese and the British Mixed Commission were there. The importance of Sierra Leone is evident through the transcription below. It is a little part of the information about Sierra Leone that British government sent to Brazilian government, not Brazilian, but in Portuguese government, but the Portuguese Portuguese authority in Brazil in 1820. Sorry. I found many people, in fact almost 10,000 people in Sierra Leone in this small period from Portuguese and the Brazilian embarkation. So finally, the ongoing research on liberated Africa in Brazil holds the promise of offer the final destination. Such a revelation is important in terms of the established impact of this group on local cultural as well as issue of socialization, as with other liberated African territories around the Atlantic. it is a research in progress. I have found different information, and how much I researched, I found many issues which connect Brazilian Sierra Leone through liberated Africa in the slave trade, illegal slave trade. I have found different connection. For example, I told to Curto yesterday, in last week I found one amazing document with connection Angola and Mozambique directly. No Brazil or America's coasts. I need to spend more time to research it, but I think we can realize different hypotheses about the transatlantic slave trade through to analyzing on liberated Africa. I hope your question after. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, teacher.
I can't pull it off as well as Michelle. This paper offers a new insight into ways in which Africans who were enslaved maintained links to their origins and life histories through their scarification and markings. Enslaved Africans preserved a variety of links to their cultures and heritage during the process of capture and transportation, but they often did so under tremendous obstacles and oppression. The histories marked upon their bodies were a means by which Africans were further able to tangibly maintain their bond with their identity as it had been shaped before their entrance into the transatlantic system. Scarification provides a means of establishing identities among Africans who were enslaved. Unlike temporary body modifications such as hairstyling, the cutting of distinct patterns into the skin provides an indelible record of birthplace and life experience. Scarification involves deliberate incision into the epidermis and interference with the healing process to produce a noticeable effect. Tattoo differs in using a piercing instrument as opposed to a slicing tool, and in the subsequent introduction of pigments into the pierced skin in patterns of greater complexity than is generally permitted by scarring. Within Africa, scarification was a common identifier in the early 19th century, with usage varying from region to region and ethnic group to ethnic group. This paper focuses on scarification practices in West Africa, as revealed in documentation on liberated Africans. Along with other body modifications, such as tattoos, scarification was a means of readily determining a given individual or a slave's origin and status. This complicates the idea of cultural erasure upon enslavement, as it has been outlined by Orlando Patterson. What does social death mean when we can talk about scarification in which connections cannot be erased? With status and birthplace permanently cut into a captive's skin, the concept of enslavement separating that person from their previous society becomes questionable. To consider this more wholly, this paper will first explore what scarification is, how it intersects with archival data from West Africa, Sierra Leone specifically, and conclude with how body markings converge with identity and constructions of ethnicity. Though scarification is a continent-wide phenomenon, the practice was particularly common in West Africa, which corresponds to the regions from which many slaves came in the early 19th century. Different scars depend on the care of the wound after it is made, and the skin type it's made upon. For a deliberate scar, modern body modification literature demonstrates that the primary interest for the purposes of producing a distinct and clear pattern is to carefully control the rate of the skin's self-repair. Scar tissue may contract as it heals, forming an indented or atrophic scar, or, if sufficiently irritated, may produce additional fibrous collagen tissue which rises above, producing an elevated scar of hypertrophic flesh. Many scars in West Africa are atrophic and tend toward longer incisions, while many West Central and Central African scarification patterns are hypertrophic and are formed of lines of raised hypertrophic scars. A further subset of scars exists, wherein the scar heals abnormally, producing much more hypertrophic flesh than is necessary, extending beyond the initial outline of the incision. This is a keloid, and keloidal scars are more common in skin belonging to those with African ancestry, as an understood rule among modern practitioners of scarification. Body modification specialists today recognize that the amount of melanin in an individual's skin dictates a great deal about the way in which the scar will heal, with darker skin tending toward hypertrophic scars or keloids. The various patterns of scarification frequently represent ethnic affiliation or membership in groups, such as the Agalawa of the Hausa, as noted by Paul Lovejoy, who has drawn attention to the importance of scarification in the context of the slave trade and identity formation, and who additionally noted the practice's regional importance. Scarification was a visual identifier that allowed those who were familiar with specific markings to identify individuals in terms of presumed ethnicity, social status, region of origin, city, and sometimes even occupation. Noted by Samuel Johnson, the late 19th century Yoruba scholar, whose detailed history of the Yoruba is widely regarded as one of the most important sources on the Yoruba in the early 19th century, or in the 19th century, scarification variations could even detail specific families in an intra-ethnic use of facial marks to indicate relationships. Worn by men and by women, by Muslims and non-Muslims, scarification could indicate religious affiliation or membership in secret societies. Certain marks upon the body might indicate the use of traditional medicines applied upon cuts made to facilitate their efficacy. The meaning and importance of scarification and marks upon the face and body have been extensively explored within the anthropology in relation to the importance of permanent markings made by a community upon an individual. As a multi-layered orthography etched upon an individual's body, such marks can indicate differences understandable from outside an ethnic group, which would demonstrate belonging to a given ethnicity, or, if understood within an ethnic group, might refer to familial origins or some of the other social identifiers I've mentioned. It can therefore be considered both a means of inter-ethnic identification, as in the case of membership within broader belief systems, or intra-ethnic when it positions an individual within the social hierarchy or blood relationships with his or her group. Using an example from Johnson, an abaja mark upon a Yoruba individual's cheek would differentiate him or her from other families within Yoruba land. As a mark used within Yoruba land, if seen by a non-Yoruba, an abaja mark might be synonymous with simply being Yoruba, while to a Yoruba, its intra-ethnic meaning would relate not to identity as a Yoruba, but to belonging to the families that wear an abaja mark. Recent accounts still ascribe the same importance and connection to family in being embodied in Yoruba marks. Understood in this sense, scarification becomes a complication to ideas of ethnicity, with inherent nuances dependent upon the perspective and the position of the onlooker. An acculturation of the individual body, markings can hold geographic indications due to trends dictated by skin variation, religious affiliation dependent upon broad inter-ethnic traditions of a region, ethnic meaning as seen from another ethnic group, keeping in mind that ethnicity is a construction, intra-ethnic indicators of membership within families, and similarly, intra-ethnic social status indicators. The inscribed body is therefore a body that conveys both individual identity and also is placed within the context of a group identity. Marks do not indicate ethnicity alone. They convey considerably more to one familiar with them. Ethnic affiliation is simply an indirect conclusion made possible by understanding them. This paper is based upon documentation derived from the registers of liberated Africans that were recorded in Sierra Leone between 1808 and 1822 and are to be found within the public archives of Sierra Leone. Following the 1807 British abolition of the slave trade, the colony of Sierra Leone became the seat of a vice admiralty court and, after 1819, a court of mixed commission, which adjudicated seized slave ships bound for the Americas. Between 1808 and 1862, approximately 92,000 enslaved Africans were systematically removed from the slave ships captured by the West Africa Squadron and from coastal barracoons holding slaves waiting to be embarked. Upon their arrival in Sierra Leone, these men, women, and children were listed in registers, which noted the names, heights, approximate ages, and general descriptions of each individual. The slaves who were subsequently freed were described as recaptives as well as liberated Africans. In some cases, the patterns of scars on their faces and bodies were recorded in the Register of Liberated Africans under the column Description. The 9 registers between 1808 and 1822 detail the period immediately after British abolition, during the period of the Vice Admiralty Court at Freetown. There are no comparable records at the British National Archives in Kew with regard to the meticulous descriptions of recaptives 1 through 15,967. Entries describe complex patterns of scars, or refer to such patterns that can be deciphered from other information. Clerks entering data meticulously noted hairstyles, complexion, marks from diseases, brands, moles, tooth filing, piercings, deformities, burns, tattoos, scars from wounds, as well as formalized scarification. Sometimes, patterns of scarification were even drawn into the registers, allowing a comparison between those sketches and later ethnographic studies. There is a general transition in the increasingly limited quantity of data provided by clerks in later registers. By 1837, there is still some differentiation for location of cuts, but they're no longer drawn or described in any detail. Recaptive 54,165, Opong, is recorded as having cuts on temples, but the following entry, Sogoba, is described as only possessing cuts on face, with no mention of shape, length, or position of the marking in question. The last register, which provides fairly consistent locations of scars, is the register which lists recaptives numbering 30,000 to 37,439, and the information primarily consists of identifying location on the body of cuts with no effort made to count their number, shape, or specific position. The most consistently detailed evidence for scarification emerges from the first 9 volumes in Freetown. This data has been transcribed as part of a larger project. The project is based on transcriptions of entries in which each recaptive was given a unique number. As an example, the project includes fields that permit comparison with patterns of scarification. The column labeled Vessel indicates information both from the manuscript and from the Transatlantic Slave Voyages database. These registers provide unique glimpses into origins and individual lives, their continuing importance supported by 19th century accounts of markings in Freetown. While the Court of Mixed Commission registers may not fully describe the marks upon recaptive bodies, the 1863 account of Robert Clark demonstrates that even after the last recaptives were entered in the final register of 1862, scarification was still a major ethnic identifier in Freetown. Despite difficulties, such as the comparative scarcity of sketched patterns, one drawn mark in the 1814-1815 register can be correlated with a mark recorded in an ethnographic study, though this project is still in its early stages. The facial marks in question belong to recaptive 5959, Kando. He was seized in July 21st, 1814 from the condemned vessel Maria Josefa, flying a Portuguese or Brazilian flag. This schooner first purchased slaves from Galinas and ended her voyage in Freetown according to the Transatlantic Slave Voyages database. Seen upon the visual template, Kando's scarification is reproduced in red ink. It is a geometric triangular patterning placed by each eye, consisting of 3 lines of equivalent length, radiating outward at roughly a 45-degree angle. The original manuscript is seen underneath. This pattern correlates with marks identified by the French ethnologist Pierre Donnet as originating in Niger at the village of Tessawa, and are associated by him as belonging to Hausa Pyo. These marks are described by him as uku uku, which in Hausa means 3-3, indicating a pattern of triple scars. The Maria Josepha's itinerary and data recovered from the Transatlantic Slave Voyages database seems to support this information. In conclusion, by considering how body marking provides a window into the construction of identity within a social context, potential unpacking of recorded scarification with the goal of determining individual origin and affiliation, both inter-ethnic and intra-ethnic, is possible. Scholars such as Patterson and Measu have considered the cultural impact of enslavement as a suspended death sentence of sorts, severing a slave from his or her prior social setting and necessitating adoption of a new social setting in which he or she finds him or herself. Scarification complicates this theory, given how many permanent marks of acculturation are embodied upon the inscribed body. As an individual was removed from a community but continued to possess a visual memory of the lost society upon his or her skin, ultimately assumptions of social death and of identity must be reconsidered and questioned. Thank you.
Well, since our third speaker is still on his way from the airport, you might as well go, Paul, and give us your spiel for about 15 minutes or so.
Well, hopefully he'll walk in.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, let me, I just want to comment that this panel and indeed the next one are part of a collaborative venture working on liberated Africans that focus on, initially on Sierra Leone, but now also, as you heard, on Brazil. And one of the reasons for this concentration is this data is a peculiar body of data. Because of the mixed commission and before that the Court of Vice Admiralty, we have an amazing collection of data on individuals who almost by random selection were picked out of the transatlantic migration of the period after 1808 till the end of the transatlantic trade in about 1860. And as we all will know, recognize is almost all of the individuals on those ships were destined for either Brazil or Cuba. There are exceptions, and of course, because of the British patrols, a lot of people ended up in Sierra Leone, and then subsequently also some in Trinidad and in various places in the Caribbean. However, for many reasons, I think that as we proceed into the collection and an analysis of data, we'll be able to do a better job. I don't think any of us have really tried to do this yet. A better job of figuring out how representative the sample of liberated Africans actually is, because while it's random on one hand, before 1831, it's basically north of the equator, and after that it's includes the whole of the Atlantic, which then brings in records from St. Helena, even a few from Rwanda and other places, so that the continued collection of the data is one part of this project. In Nielsen's paper, for example, as he indicated from his analysis, but just to give you a little bit of background, there is a project that's underway in Brazil, particularly right now in Rio de Janeiro, in the collection of material and the digitizing of material. And we're far from finished. And similarly with Katrina's paper drawing specifically on Sierra Leone, this grows out of a British Library project that Suzanne Schwartz and I have co-directed. And here comes our next speaker at this very moment. And What should we do?
Get him right.
Get him down here? Does he think he's jet lagged
Give it
sufficiently?
5
So
seconds. Give it 5 minutes.
we'll let him sit down first, or no? Or should I continue for a minute?
Just listen to you.
Carl, you want? Just as I continue while we move on, the Sierra Leone data is more complex in some ways than what we originally thought, because not only are there records in the Sierra Leone Public Archives in Freetown, but as we've known for a long time, there are extensive documentation in the National Archives at Kew in London. And as we now know, there are even more copies of these various documents, and we're still trying to sort out which are the originals, which are the copies, and indeed in Sierra Leone we still have not found two of the volumes. They're there somewhere, but the archives are in such a state of disarray that where they are, they've lost their covers, which is probably the reason why we can't find them yet.
Okay, so, you ready?
But we'll let Carlos take over, and then I'll rejoin.
And you'll continue.
Then I'll continue.
So, here's Carlos da Silva, and he's talking on, I got it on my page here, on towards by Benin and the illegal slave trade to Bahia, Brazil, 1750 to 1815. So 15 minutes or better.
Hello everyone, good morning, thank you for waiting for me. I just arrived from Brazil, stopped in Toronto and then in Ottawa, and I will try to talk everything I have to say in the next 15 minutes. I would like to thank to Professor Lovejoy, to Professor Kur, to Professor Susan Schwartz and Nielsen, and Vanessa Oliveira as well, for the invitation to be here today for this conference. And in this conference, I want to talk about the role played by the ports of the Bight of Benin to the slave trade to Bahia. Thanks to the Pierre Rivége's works, we know a lot now about these ports, about the relation between these ports in the Bight of Benin and the slave trade to Bahia, the ethnicity, but we know more about the numbers of the slave trade to Bahia thanks to the transatlantic slave trade database, and also because of our knowledge about the African history now. So I will try to talk a little about these talks. The title of my presentation is Ports of Bight of Benin and the Illegal Slave Trade to Bahia, Brazil, 1750-1850. An estimated around 413,000 enslaved Africans arrived in Bahia from different parts of Africa during the second half of the 18th century. Of this total, around 241,000 came from the Bight of Benin, the most important region of slave trade between Bahia and Africa during the 18th century. It represents almost 60% of all Africans entering Bahia during the period. If between 1750 the trade was concentrated at Ouidah or Judá, the largest slave port of the slave coast of West Africa, from 1750 the slave trade moved into ports east from Ouidah, as Porto Novo, Badagry, and in the 1770s, Unim or Lagos. Each of these ports in different periods provided enslaved Africans for the plantations and the urban cities in Salvador and its hinterland. Obviously, people from different ethnic groups were enslaved and deported to Bahia through these ports. Local documentation presents the major African nations in Bahia in the 18th century. The purpose of this presentation is to analyze the trade between Bahia and the main ports of Bight of Benin, with some focus on Porto Novo and the main ethnic groups introduced into Bahia, Brazil before 1815, when the slave trade north of Ecuador, the Bight of Benin, became an illegal activity. Under the reign of Agaja, 1716 to 1740, the kingdom of Dahomey became the major supplier of slaves to the Atlantic slave trade through the Bight of Benin. After the conquest of Alada, 1724, and Uida, 1727, Dahomey controlled the trade in the littoral of the Bight of Benin. After Agaja's death, 1740, his son Tegbeso attempted to keep the trade with the European nations in the same volumes which achieved during his father's reign. However, the organization of trade between Bahia and Bight of Benin had changed at that time. Since the 1740s, the businessmen homens de negócio in Bahia reorganized the slave trade to the Costa da Mina. According to their complaints, the huge number of ships from Bahia and Pernambuco going to Uida was the responsible for the disorganization of the trade there. Therefore, the businessmen wrote to King João V, suggesting that only 24 slave ships, called in Portuguese navios do número, ships of the number, could trade in slaves on the Costa da Mina, leaving the port of Salvador every 3 months. The king accepted their suggestion, and these trades began to control the slave trade to Costa da Mina. By this time, the late 1740s and beginning of 1750s, however, slave trade were already moving to ports east of Uida, called in Portuguese portos de baixo, or ports from below, far from the Dahomean control. Price of slaves at Uida were becoming excessively higher than in other slaving ports, such as Porto Novo and Badalho. Moreover, with the prohibition of 2 Portuguese ships stopped at Uida at the same time, slave ships captains were seeking other ports in the Bight of Benin, where there was no such restriction. By the 1750s, Uida had to face competition of Porto Novo, which was increasing as a slaving port. The voyage, the transatlantic slave trade database, shows that between 1750 and 1760, an estimated 54,000 slaves entered Bahia from the Bight of Benin. Uida was estimated to export around 8,000 and 9,000 slaves annually. In 1765, Uida exported annually 5,000 slaves, while Porto Novo contributed with 1,200. 20 years later, an estimated 12,000 slaves were being deported annually from the Bight of Benin for the Atlantic markets. Of this total, Uida accounted for 4,500 in Porto Novo and Badalho, together with 3,500. In the last quarter of the 18th century, Porto Novo emerged as the main supplier of enslaved Africans to the Atlantic slave trade, leaving the Bight of Benin. According to David Eltz, between 1776 and 1880, an estimated 96,000 Africans were shipped to the Americas. In the same period, Uida exported 78,000 slaves. Porto Novo, also known as Newport in the Portuguese documentation, is the name of the Kingdom of Hogmono, a section of the royal family of Alada, specifically a fugitive prince of the dynasty of Alada, after the conquest by Dahomey in 1724, settled north bank of the lagoon east of Lake Nokwe, probably about 1730, founding a new Alada kingdom or Porto Novo. Although local traditions claim its origins much earlier before in 1808, it seems clear its foundation occurred, in fact, in the early 1730s. Contemporary sources claim that the opening of slave trade in Porto Novo was possible thanks to the efforts of João de Oliveira, African-born former slave of Pernambuco, Brazil, arrested in Salvador in 1770 under the suspicion of introducing prohibited items of trade from the Costa da Mina into Bahia. João de Oliveira was in activity at Porto Novo since at least 1750s. The director of the Portuguese fort of Ajudá, Teodósio Rodrigues da Costa, wrote to Viceroy of Brazil, Dom Marcos de Noronha, Conde dos Arcos, attesting that João de Oliveira opened a new port, o Porto Novo, where slaves were being sold in exchange of between 8 and 12 tobacco rolls. At Uidá, on the other hand, one slave was being sold for higher prices, between 13 and 16 rolls of Brazilian tobacco. A few years later, the Homens de Negócio of Bahia recognized the role played by João de Oliveira in Porto Novo. João de Oliveira had lived for 37 years on the Costa da Mina. He was a general defense of the Portuguese navigation, this is the expression of the documentation, and he opened with his own expenses 2 ports of trade, not only Porto Novo, but also Onim or Lagos. João de Oliveira would have played the role of king, or caboci certainly at Porto Novo, the main assistant of Portuguese nation in that coast. Again, the words of the documentation. Oliveira attested he had lived on the Costa da Mina and worked as caboci, enjoyed the king's confidence. It's likely that João de Oliveira moved into the Costa da Mina in the 1730s during Agaja's reign, fixing his operation first at Uidá, right, and then moved to Porto Novo in the early 1750s. Although there is no evidence so far on his presence at Uidá. I'm researching about the Atlantic trajectory of João de Oliveira also. Porto Novo and Badrague would become the base of oil operation of the slave trade. Since Tegbeso's rise to the throne of Dahomey in 1740, the wars and raids by Dahomey were not enough to supply the amount of slaves required for the Atlantic slave trade. Therefore, Dahomey began to act as a middleman, selling the slaves brought to Uidá after Tegbesos made peace with the Kingdom of Oyo in 1748. In the meantime, Dahomey also purchased slaves from the Mahi country, its northeast neighbor. By the 1770s, Oyo was regarded as the source of most of slaves deported through Uidá, especially to Bahia, in the French Caribbean colonies, particularly Saint-Domingue. It seems clear that the most of these slaves captured by Oyo belonged to Yoruba-speaking groups or Yoruba-speaking people. Therefore, one can trace the Yoruba diaspora to Bahia prior to the rise and fall of the Oyo Empire in the late 18th and 19th century. In this paper, in order to identify the ethnic origins of the enslaved Africans shipped to Bahia during the second half of the 18th century, I used the inventories post-mortem recorded in Salvador between 1750s and 18th. I'm creating a very large database with all slaves of different origins since the 17th, the beginning of the 18th century, until the 19th century. The Salvador Inventory slave database shows that Yoruba groups, called Naguas, in Bahia represented only 2.9% of the total of slaves, including Bahia-born slaves. David Eld suggests that from 1720s to the rise of Lagos, a mix of Guibé and Yoruba speakers were enslaved and shipped to the Americas through the ports of Uidá, Porto Novo, Badrague, and Lagos. As Paulo Vedel points out, the concentration of Yoruba in Bahia can be traced to the second half of the 18th century. Maria Inês Cortes de Oliveira has provided for the interval between 1775 and 1850 some information in which Nago are 37.4% of the Africans, very close to the Jejis, 38.9%, in a sample of 537 slaves in Bahia whose ethnicity is provided. It's important to say, however, that these Yorubas were probably concentrated in inventories of the 19th century, even if they entered Bahia in the late 18th century. The overwhelming majority of enslaved Africans belonged to Guibé-speaking groups, Aja, Mahi, Gun, Fon, etc. It's not worse that Guibé speakers, Mina, Jeje, Gentil da Costa, and Alada, represented almost 35% of all slaves in the inventories post-mortem. Hausa groups appears with only 0.1% of the register. It should be noted, however, that Hausa represented around 10% of Africans buried in Salvador during the 70s, just during this period. Perhaps additional quantitative research, baptismal records that registers may highlight the Hausa diaspora to Brazil in the 18th century. In sum, the process of Bight of Benin played a critical role in the making of African community in Bahia. The more complex understanding of the political situation on the slave coast of West Africa during this time can help us to highlight hidden identities in the 18th century Bahia in the era of the transatlantic slave trade. I would have some things more to say, but because of the time, if you want to ask me something later, it's okay. Thank you.
You can continue, Paul.
Thank you. I will continue. Very quickly, I want to talk about Becerra's paper in which he mentioned the different periodization in terms of legality and 1818, 1831, the idea that there's 14 years of apprenticeship with liberated Africans. All of these, the dates and this period of time for liberated Africans of apprenticeship are issues that on both sides of the Atlantic are of great concern and great interest in terms of trying to figure out how representative the sample is, where the system of apprenticeship came from, and in fact in Sierra Leone we know sometimes it was 7 years, not 14, and when it ended. All of these are issues that have to be raised. He pointed out very clearly that men ended up very much in public works, while women and children ended up very much in factories. And it should be pointed out that his lists of marks were all marks of slavery. There weren't any, I don't think, any marks that were actually scarifications on this, which shows the type of branding that was going on in some parts of Africa in the 19th century. We need to know a lot more about. And indeed, his very interesting, the fact that in Brazil, discovering information that relates specifically to Sierra Leone is something that we want to draw attention to. It's extremely important and calls for a lot more further research. And then his most recent spectacular discovery, which is the connection between Angola and Mozambique in ways which we have never thought was possible and we did not think existed. And yet he has found information showing very close connection, at least at a particular point in time in the 19th century. One question I will ask of all three panelists, and this is a really thorny issue, it relates to the issue of nation, ethnicity, and what is meant by those terms. I think we're seeing some very interesting patterns that emerge, that in Brazil, nation means something that is quite, in certain kinds of ways, strange, because it's not what's often meant in other places, because Mozambique becomes a nation, and what this actually means in reality is something that needs to be deconstructed, taken apart. And is similar, I would say, with Carlos's paper and indeed with Katrina's paper. What it means to be Yoruba is also a big issue. But let me just continue with Katrina's excellent paper on scarification. The paper does raise the issue of what does ethnic identity mean. And using the example of Agalawa in particular, which comes from my own research, it's both scarification indicates in some senses ethnicity, but in other senses it does not at all, because Agalawa markings, anybody with Agalawa markings would certainly be Hausa, but that isn't the reason that people have, the Agalawa markings are not Hausa markings. They're very specifically to a group within Hausa society, and it relates to the origins of those people rather than to anything to do with ethnicity as we sometimes think of it. And in that regard, I'd like her to expand more, if possible, on what she means by family, because she's talking about, in her cases, about markings that belong to the mother's family and belong to the father's family. And the Agalawa markings in Hausa society are also family. You get them because your parents have them, and your modifications would depend upon who your mother and who your father is. But in the Hausa case, and I also believe in the Yoruba case, they really mean origins. They mean where you came from. They don't really mean narrowly define whatever we mean by ethnicity. And so that I think that on both sides of the Atlantic that we are coming up against is a reconceptualization, a questioning of what is meant by ethnicity. It's a term that I like less and less myself. And I think that some of the complexities that we're seeing here show that. For example, in Katrina's paper, where she's looking at what was listed in the chart as Puro, or what in fact is Poro. Poro is specifically not ethnic. It goes across ethnic groups. It relates to specifically to a secret society which crosses ethnic groups. So therefore, to see it as these scarifications in some ways as a reflection of ethnicity is too simplistic. I would say the same about Uku, the Hausa markings, which she had one showing of, but all the Uku markings that I knew, there are Uku markings that come from the corner of your mouth. It just means 3-3, and they don't come together, they're parallel, so that whether they're parallel or not, I don't know what significance that might have, but I'm sure it did. In specific contexts, it had real, a very specific meanings. Quickly to move on to Carlos's paper, it's very good. I'm extremely interested in the work because of my own work on the Bight of Benin. And it's good to see that Pierre Verger's work is being reconsidered and looking at. But again, the same issue of ethnicity. What does ethnicity mean? 10% being Hausa, or all these people being Yoruba, or Nago, what does that mean? In my opinion, and I would ask him, all it really means is language. It doesn't mean anything to do with ethnicity. It means these are the people who speak that particular language. And where they actually came from, or what their actual backgrounds are, almost inevitably would be much more complex than a simple Yoruba-Hausa distinction. I'm really extremely interested in what you're doing on Rivera. This is very important research, I must say. And but I would ask you a question. In Porto Novo, which you quite accurately described as when it became important and why it became important as an outlet for Oyo, specifically under the reign of Abiodun, specifically in order to bypass Dahomey and hence bypass Ouida as an outlet. The Portuguese involvement in this is extremely important, but also is the French. The French involvement is extremely important as well, and many of the people that went out from Porto Novo, indeed Badagry, went to French islands rather than to Brazil. And in that regard, I would draw your attention to, and I'm sure you know him, but the local merchant in Porto Novo was Pierre Tamata, and Pierre Tamata was a Hausa by origin. He'd been educated in France. He'd been returned to Porto Novo, where he became the wealthiest merchant, Rivera aside, in Porto Novo throughout the 1770s and 1780s, and indeed continuing after. And his family continued to be important right through the 19th century. And I've actually done interviewing with descendants of Pierre Tamata in Porto Novo. Pierre Tamata was Muslim, and he was Hausa by origin, but of course he spoke Yoruba because Porto Novo was an outlet for Yoruba. So again, we come back to this, what does ethnicity really mean? And we need to know more about him. So with those comments, I'd like to throw it open and let Jose take over in terms of taking questions or letting the three panelists respond to some of my comments. Thanks.
So, thank you, Paul. Questions? Suzanne, and then Marty, and then Nielsen. You start out.
Well, my question is for Nielsen. I was interested in the
Africans in Brazil, it was a big deal in the 19th century because it was an indefinite social category. The Brazilian government didn't solve the social problem on liberated African Brazil long 19th century. Because we had different legislations about it. The Brazilian government tried many times to solve it, but they didn't. Because the slave trade in Brazil had different interests. The people from government normally are the same people who had slave trade, practiced slave trade, or had slave, or explored the work on liberated Africa. I have to impress them with the Finnish emancipated of liberated Africa in 1864 or 1863, because in fact if you think it after the 14 years after 1850, but many liberated Africa worked before 850, but they considered the layers of Queiroz, how they start to account the years for liberated Africa. And finally, it total over the 14 years, because the people was working before.
Yeah, my question really goes outside the liberated African question, and it's for Carlos that Paul probably might answer it. I'm curious about some of the routes that slave ships, why certain areas fed certain areas. You talked about the slaves from the routes from the Bight of Benin going to Bahia. I'm sort of curious because 2 weeks ago I was in a boat that was fighting against the westerly winds and making me seasick. And I then went to a conference that dealt with New Orleans, where slave culture was founded by Bambara, but in the latter part of the 18th century, slaves were coming in from Central Africa, most of the slaves in the Mississippi. Actually, even though Mississippi slave culture has a heavy Bambara imprint, the same way South Carolina culture has a heavy Guinea Coast imprint. Both of them get more slaves from Central in the long run, because the later migrations that move into an area with a pre-existing, what I'm now starting to call a founding culture. And I'm sort of curious why ships from Central Africa are going to the Mississippi and South Carolina. And I mean, you seem to have crisscross. That I'm sort of curious about what determines who goes where. I assume the westerlies have something to do with it, the different wind currents. And yet, when I look at the map, people don't seem to be choosing the shortest routes.
Well, it's important to say that there was a slave trade between Bahia and West Central Africa also. It's because in this paper, I focus on the Bight of Benin, but when I finish my paper, I show it to Professor José Couto by table, my database, with information about West Central African ethnicities. So, which means that there's the slave trade between West Central Africa, specifically Angola and Benguela, and Bahia as well. The question is, because of the tobacco, as showed, the relation between Bahia and Bight of Benin, specifically Ouida, during the beginning of the 18th century and later, Porto Novo, Badar, and Lagos become strong. But there is this connection between Bahia and West Central Africa also. It's a very strong connection. For example, in my database, I can tell you that around 20% of the ethnicities I've found are from the West Central Africa. So I showed around 35% of the ethnicities from the Bight of Benin, including Nagos, Jejes, Minas, etc. And around 20% from the West Central Africa. So the slave trade between Bahia and West Central Africa was important also as well. The only question is the role played by the Bahian tobacco, the Brazilian tobacco, in this relation between Bahia and Bight of Benin, became these links, this commercial ties more strictly, more strong. That's what I would say.
But what you're saying is that the wind structure, the nature of the winds and currents and the distance has nothing to do with which slave ships went where.
Perhaps, for example, Luis Felipe de Alencastro has showed for the connections between Bahia and Angola that the winds played an important role, a critical role in the slave trade between these two regions. For the West Central African Bahia, the same thing. There's a wind called, I don't know how to say it in English, Corrente Benguela.
Yeah, the Benguela current.
The Benguela current. That's important because it crosses Benguela, Angola, and then Bahia and Rio. So the winds are important also in this connection. But for commercial regions, Bahia established a link much stronger with the Bight of Benin than with the West Central. Not so strong because, as I showed you, 20% of enslaved Africans here came from the West Central Africa. So we still need to research more about the links. I would do that between Bahia and West Central Africa also. That's what I would say.
Well, just a final comment. I would suggest that you have to look at both the nature of demand, where the prices are, whether it's worthwhile for a ship captain to take an extra week, for example, and lose more slaves in the voyage. So you have to look at the nature of the demand and the prices, but you also have to look at the currents, the Benguela current, which is a very nice current.
In terms of time, the difference is not so big. It's 35 days to Bight of Benin, 40 days to Angola. So.
Yeah.
And you also got to say that the presence of Bahian merchants in Luanda or Benguela is not constant.
Yeah.
These guys are going in and out of that particular leg of the trade. There are moments where they concentrate in Luanda and in Benguela as well, and consequently you see a relatively large movement of West Central Africans into Bahia. And then there are other moments where they're hardly in Angola at all, and they're just cycling off from the Bahia.
So the presence of Bahian merchants in Lagos and Ouida becomes a factor in the nature of the shipping.
It's a much more permanent position.
Yeah, there's a factory in Ouida. There's a port in Ouida. There was later a port, 5 ports in Badagry, 5 factories in Badagry, ports in Lagos. So the presence of Bahian merchants there was.
Since my name was mentioned too, I'll jump in just by saying, yes, wind currents are very important, no question about it, but increasingly as wind currents are understood, it's only one factor. And I think one of the things that all of this work is showing, and the work in the 19th century, is one of the crucial things that's been understudied is the importance of agency on the African coast. And so that you see Rivera, he's really feeding the Brazilian trade, while Pierre Tamata is feeding the French trade. And so that you have that local merchant who's very wealthy, who was helping to ship and organize the departure and the destination of people. And you see this in the 19th century too, because you see you see Cuban ships in Brazil and you see Brazilian ships in Cuba. And they're coming from the same places in Africa, but who are they taking to which place? This is being determined in Africa as much as it is on board ship.
And I would also want
It's
to
the same pattern in Rwanda, of
Yeah.
course.
And I'd like to complexify this whole question of identity, because it's not just in terms of the slaves that are being moved, but also the people that are moving there, right? So, you know, you mentioned Portuguese earlier. Well, this is really, in this case, is really a Brazilian dominated. And to what extent are you going to label that specifically Brazilian as opposed to Portuguese, for example?
It is Brazilian.
Yeah, it brings up the whole question of, well, when do we start to see Brazilians? That's also an interesting one.
Well, WIDA is under.
Yeah.
Is under by WIDA.
That's right.
I have two comments. First, I would like to thank Carlos because he accepted to stop in Canada in his trip between Brazil to England. Only for this panel. Thank you, my friend. I have two comments about it. About one, the talk by Carlos and the talk by Katrina. For Carlos first, when I was a PhD candidate, normally I talk for everybody. I was research about ethnicity. But now I'm escaping from this term because it is more complexity than the information provided for document for us. In Brazilian document, we can find the different terms. What we suppose it is a ethnicity, but in fact it was not ethnicity. Probably it is a nation of this military. So I would like to hear about your ideas about it. For Katrina, I found many information about about your topic in Brazilian documents, but I tended to separate the mark of slavery and the nation scarification. It for me it's clear. In my document, in Brazilian document, normally I found more mark of slavery than nation scarification. In opposite, for example, Cuba, Henry Lovejoy found many African names in the nation scarification for Cuba, for example. I would like to know from you what you think about if you consider this difference in your research.
I'll reply to that, and then I want to address what Paul mentioned in terms of family and differentiations in family and ethnicity. So in terms of the difference between marks of slavery versus scarification, marks of ethnicity, yeah, I do definitely keep that in mind because one of the things in the Freetown registers is they definitely record brands are almost inevitably drawn, and they're drawn quite clearly again and again and again throughout the marks. So there seems to be a pattern in terms of what the clerks wanted to draw. The brands for sure. Some of the scars seem to have just been notable or interesting, so they did those. But yeah, brands are, in terms of my own research, I keep track of it. When I'm transcribing, I make mention of it, but I don't necessarily, I'm looking at that as very much a separate category from the rest, while keeping in mind, when I look at various scars, some of those scars are explicitly from warfare. There's one that's a cutlass scar. It's clearly identified. Obviously, they had the sword to be able to match it up. there seems to be a series of different categories within the data that I'm working in. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. And with regard to the question of family and ethnicity, I think it's a really excellent, it's something I think about a great deal, increasingly so, because I find also ethnicity is becomes a loaded word that's very deceptively simple. And it seems like it makes sense, and then the more I look into scarification, the more I realize just how much it really depends where you're standing, it depends who you are in relation to the person who's wearing what particular mark. So it can be, right now I'm kind of pointing and thinking of it in terms of inter-ethnic, in the case of something like Poro marks, where it's really not ethnic, but I can say that it's a regional thing because you're not going to find Poro in Nigeria or in Barbaland or in Cameroon, anything like that. You're going to find it in a specific region. But it's not really saying anything about people who have it, other than that they're coming from a region in which Poro exists. And at the same time, in terms of when I look at Johnson's markings for the Abaja, Pele, Gongo, etc., for the Yoruba, I'm forced to think about it less in terms of family, although that's the word that he uses, and more in terms of intra-ethnic identifiers there. Because he describes it and specifically notes variations, for instance, especially within the Abaja, saying these indicate people who are descended from royal family of oil. But then he goes into differentiations and variations and saying this one might be this branch, this one might be that branch. So the terminology seems very family oriented, but I don't think that's necessarily entirely on.
They're even more political because he says Ijebu, Oyo, and he's really identifying specific political entities.
Yeah, so what I'm finding more and more is that the terminology doesn't quite fit, so I think they have to come up with a bunch of terms.
Okay, thank you. Carlos, so your take on ethnicity.
Oh, okay. Well, both Professor Loja and Nielsen are right. We need to be careful when I'm dealing with ethnicity, because when I'm talking about Nago, me, Nigeria, I'm not talking about ethnic really, but I'm talking about ethnic labels imposed by the transatlantic slave trade. So when I'm saying Nago, I'm not talking about a specific group. I'm talking about a set of people who speak the same language, the Yoruba language, and they were brought together in the same ethnic label, the Nago. So that's why I need to look at the African history to understand which people were enslaved in the Bight of Benin or in West Central Africa, in order to identify the ethnic origin of these people. But both of you are right. It's very complicated. It's very complex to deal with the questions of the ethnicity.
You just showed me something earlier, a list of ethnic groups. Really interesting. Two of them popped up right away. One is Luanda. Luanda is not an ethnic group. Ambaka is not an ethnic group. Exactly. So what you're having here is actually place of birth. Okay? And so you start to see these very, very complicated levels of identification that mean different things in different places. Okay? In Benguela, you have a Benguela nation, just like you have in Brazil. Explain that one. Okay? You have an Angola nation in Angola. Explain that. That's an easy one, by the way. Okay? But it's just to feed into these various levels of identification that is being attributed to people. That it need not necessarily be linguistic affiliation, place of birth, ethnic and so on and so forth. It may be a variety of things, all sort of lumped together. And our job is really difficult here, trying to disentangle all of this stuff over time and space. Marty, last word.
Okay. Can I just follow up? As I listened to, I've always had no interest in scarification, but scarification, if we have enough data on it, may give us a finer picture than ethnic labels, because I've long argued that ethnic labels are very fluid, and just an example, Ibrahim Assak, talking about the Senegambian migration, pointed out that everybody's either been Bambara or Mandinka. Some Wolof, particularly in the early period. But the people coming from Mali are either Bambara. You don't have any Soninke, you don't have any Sorko, you don't have any Simono. You have a few, but not very many. And it's quite clear that many of these people who get swept up, who are the Bambara states raiding? You know, and why do the people who are victims get labeled as Bambara? And they come to the Mississippi and they're Bambara, even though they may be something else to start with. And the second thing is a modern question, but it relates to this Luanda point. I was in a conversation about the fact that Senegal's has had four presidents of three different ethnicities, and I tried to use the current president. And the guy I was talking to said it was Tukulur. He said, yeah, he's Tukulur, but he was raised in Fatigue, and he's married to a San Louisiana.